on December 26, 1944, the bells of a small stone church in the Italian village of Somocolonia stood silent under a low winter sky. Snow clung to red-tiled roofs and narrow lanes, and smoke from cook fires threaded through the cold air as German troops moved through the streets below. On the second floor of a modest house on a hillside overlooking the village, First Lieutenant John Robert Fox, a wiry 29-year-old artillery observer from Ohio, watched them come on, knowing that in a few minutes he would make a choice that would cost him his life and save hundreds of others. American infantry had already been forced to withdraw from Somocolonia under the weight of a determined German attack, leaving only a handful of men and a few Italian partisans behind to slow the advance. Below Fox's vantage point, German soldiers, part of a broader offensive across the Apennines, poured into the village, using alleys and doorways for cover as they pushed toward the last American positions. Somewhere behind the ridges to the south, U.S. artillery lay ready, silent for the moment, waiting for the coordinates that only Fox could see and only Fox could send. What he did in that upper room alone with his radio and his map, while an overconfident enemy commander drove his men forward, instead of accepting that the village should already have been given up, would disappear into obscurity for decades. It would delay a German advance, help stabilize a front line in the mountains of northern Italy, and leave nearly 100 German bodies scattered around the ruin of a single house. And for more than 50 years, almost no one beyond his family and a few comrades would know his name. John Robert Fox had been born in Cincinnati, Ohio on May 18, 1915, the son of a working-class African-American family in a country still marked by segregation and limited opportunity. He grew up in neighborhoods where jobs were scarce and expectations often modest.
Slow down!
But from an early age, he showed a quiet determination that took him beyond the boundaries many assumed for him. He was not especially tall or physically imposing, but he carried himself with a seriousness that teachers and neighbors remembered, a steady presence rather than a loud one. Education was his path forward, and Fox worked his way into Wilberforce University in Ohio, one of the oldest historically black universities in the United States. There he entered the Reserve Officers Training Corps, studying not just military drill but the mathematics and map reading that would later define his role as an artillery officer. The campus in the 1930s and early 1940s was a place of limited resources but strong ambition, where young black men and women tried to build lives in a country that often did not see their full worth. By the time the United States entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Fox was already on the path to commission. He received his officer's bars and was assigned to the 366th Infantry Regiment, a segregated African-American unit that would serve in the Italian campaign. The 366th formed part of a military system that kept black soldiers largely separate from white units, often doubting their abilities and limiting their roles, even as the war demanded thousands of new leaders and specialists. Italy, by 1944, was a grinding mountainous front that many soldiers later described as some of the hardest terrain in Europe. After the landings at Salerno and Anzio and the brutal fight up the peninsula through places like Monte Cassino, Allied forces had pushed north into the Apennines, where winter turned every road into mud and every ridgeline into a fortified obstacle. German forces, veterans of years of war, withdrew slowly, trading space for time. But they never yielded ground without a price. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers Division, was the main African-American infantry division in the European theater, and elements of the 366th were attached to it in the later stages of the Italian campaign. Fox, now serving as a forward observer with the 598th Field Artillery Battalion supporting those troops, moved into the hilltop village of Somocolonia as winter closed in. The village sat north of the Serchio River, part of a line of small towns and heights that shielded approaches to the city of Lucca, and, beyond that, the valley leading to the Po River plains. By late December 1944, as the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive in Belgium, they also struck in Italy, seeking to exploit thin Allied lines and reclaim some initiative in the south. In the Serchio Valley, German units probed and then hit hard, sending infantry and supporting weapons against small American and Italian partisan garrisons. Somokolonia, with its stone houses and narrow streets, became one of those targets, a place where an aggressive German commander pushed his men forward instead of consolidating or withdrawing in the face of initial resistance. Fox's unit had been in the area for days, tired but experienced, accustomed to cold nights in foxholes, unreliable roads, and the constant threat of German counterattack. On Christmas night and into the early hours of December 26th, small arms fire and patrol clashes signaled that something larger was coming. As reports filtered in, Fox and a small team of observers moved into a vantage point in the upper story of a house, prepared to call in artillery if the Germans tried to force their way through. By dawn, the situation had clarified into something far more dangerous than a simple skirmish. American infantry in the village were outnumbered and outgunned, and German troops were massing in strength, confident that they could take the hilltop by sheer pressure. It was into this tightening ring that Fox looked when the clock reached 0800 and the Germans, urged on by their own commanders, pressed in instead of pausing or accepting the villages already lost. In the hours and minutes before that moment, the American dispositions around Somokolonia had loosened under the strain of combat. Infantry companies, supported by Italian partisans, held scattered positions in and around the village foxholes on the slopes, sandbag corners, and improvised firing points in doorways and windows. The battalion command posts and heavier weapons lay to the south, on lower ground beyond the village, where radios and telephone lines linked them to artillery batteries further back. German forces advancing on Somokolonia belonged to units that had fought in Italy for months and were well practiced in infiltration and village fighting. They moved under cover of darkness and early morning fog into positions on the approaches to the town, bringing with them machine guns, mortars, and light artillery. Their commanders understood that if they seized the village quickly, they could unhinge the local American line and open a path deeper into the valley. Fox, officially, was not supposed to be the man left in the center of that storm. As a forward artillery observer, his role was to identify targets, relay precise coordinates, and then reposition when threatened, preserving his life and skill so he could continue to guide fire for the battalion. Forward observers were valuable specialists, not expendable riflemen, and doctrine emphasized their survival as essential to the effectiveness of the guns. But as the German attack gathered, that doctrine collided with reality. Runners arrived with grim news. American infantry on the outskirts of Somokolonia were being overwhelmed, communication lines were cut, and German units were bypassing strong points and filtering into the streets. Radio reports from other observers grew sparse, as positions were overrun or withdrawn under pressure. The crisis crystallized when commanders realized that the few remaining Americans in the village, along with their Italian allies, could not hold against the numbers now pushing in. If the German advance continued unchecked, they could drive through Somokolonia, roll up neighboring positions, and badly disrupt the broader American defensive line. Orders went out for most remaining U.S. troops to pull back, trading the village for time and regrouping on more defensible terrain. In that moment, Fox made a decision that ran directly against his own safety and, in some ways, his assigned role. He volunteered to stay behind with a small group of observers and partisans, taking up his station on the second floor of a house that commanded a view of the streets and approaches. From there, he would call artillery onto the enemy as they moved in, slowing them, breaking them up, and buying precious hours for the Americans reorganizing to the south. It was, even before his last order, a choice that carried a high likelihood of death. In the upper room, Fox's world narrowed to the map, the radio, the crack of rifles, and the distant rumble of guns he could not see. The floorboards were cold under his boots, and the plaster walls around him shivered as rounds struck nearby buildings. Outside, the village sounded like a storm, the staccato of automatic fire, the occasional boom of a mortar, the shouted commands of German non-commissioned officers urging men forward. At first, he directed artillery fire onto the outskirts of Somokolonia, calling in shells on the routes the Germans used to approach the village. He read off coordinates, adjusted for range and deflection, and listened for the reports of impacts from other observers and from the pattern of explosions echoing through the hills. The guns behind him, 155mm pieces, and other field artillery, answered, sending heavy shells arching over the ridges to crash into trees, stone walls, and pockets of advancing infantry. Wave after wave of German soldiers tried to push into the streets, only to be met by the sudden concussive arrival of high-explosive rounds. Fox adjusted the fire again and again. Drop 100 yards, shift left, lengthen, shorten, always seeking the densest clusters of gray-green uniforms in the alleys and open spaces. Each adjustment brought the barrage slightly closer to his own position, tightening the circle of destruction around the heart of the village. As the minutes stretched, the Germans adapted. Survivors from the first barrages hugged the sides of buildings, using the stone walls as shields against shrapnel, and pushed forward under the cover of smoke and dust. Some moved in small groups, sprinting across intersections. Others tried to flank the known American positions, snipers looking for any sign of movement in the upper stories. The air inside the house grew thick, with dust shaken from the ceiling, and every detonation outside sent a fine rain of plaster down onto Fox's map and radio. He had been in that position, directing fire, for tens of minutes that felt like hours. Each new request for adjustment passed through his hands, each new salvo of shells marking a fresh attempt to blunt the German momentum. His hands, numb from the cold, worked the radio controls with deliberate care, even as the sound of gunfire grew louder and closer outside the walls. Eventually, Fox could see German soldiers in the very streets below his window. They were no longer distant figures in the outskirts, but close, individual shapes moving across the cobbles, some firing up at windows, others dragging machine guns into position at corners and doorways. The house that sheltered him and the partisans had become, in effect, a small island inside an ocean of enemy infantry. He called for the artillery to come in closer. New coordinates went out, bringing the impact points nearer to the center of the village, nearer to the very building where he crouched by the window. American gunners, trusting his judgment, shifted their aim accordingly, and fresh bursts of high explosive tore into the German ranks, blowing out walls and ripping through groups of men as they tried to reorganize. But the enemy commander remained determined. The Germans pressed on, confident in their numbers and the impression that American resistance in the village was collapsing. Fox understood that their momentum, if unchecked, would carry them past his position and into the open ground behind the village, where regrouping American units would be far more vulnerable. At some point, the artillery fire reached the edge of what doctrine called danger close, the line beyond which friendly troops were almost certain to be hit. The observer on the other end of Fox's radio traffic, hearing the coordinates, realized that the next adjustment would bring the full weight of the barrage directly onto the spot from which Fox was transmitting. He warned Fox that if he brought the fire in any near, it would fall right on top of him. Fox did not back away. He insisted on the last adjustment, knowing that the Germans were now all around his position and that only a devastating point-blank barrage could break their hold on the village streets. Later accounts recall that he explained his decision in terms as simple and cold as the December air. There were more of them than there were of the Americans still in Somocolonia, and this was the only way to stop them. Seconds later, the shells began to fall. The first impacts tore through the buildings nearest his vantage point, shattering roofs and hurling stone fragments into the ranks of the German infantry in the open. The house where Fox had been calling the fire shook under the blows, windows imploding inward, beams splintering as the blast waves hammered the structure again and again. In those final moments, the distance between Fox and the center of the barrage was effectively zero. He had brought the storm down not just around himself, but on himself, trading his life for the destruction of the enemy units crowding the streets and courtyards of Somocolonia. Outside, German soldiers who had been pressing forward now broke, some cut down where they stood, others stumbling, stunned, as the carefully plotted artillery pattern erased their formations. The barrage went on for minutes that felt much longer to anyone within range. When the guns finally fell silent, the village lay shrouded in dust and smoke, punctuated by the occasional crackle of fire from shattered buildings. Fox's radio was quiet. The turning point of the battle for Somocolonia came in that sudden, brutal storm of artillery that Fox had summoned. German infantry units that had been confident of taking the village now stumbled in confusion, their ranks torn apart, squad leaders and junior officers among the many killed or wounded in the concentrated barrage. Estimates compiled later suggested that approximately 100 German soldiers died in and around the ruins of the house where Fox made his last stand. The loss of so many men in such a small area had a psychological effect as well as a physical one. Survivors found themselves picking their way through bodies and rubble, their cohesion shaken, their advance thrown off balance by the sudden annihilation of a key spearhead element. Attempts to regroup for renewed pushes met more artillery fire and continued resistance from the remaining American and partisan positions around the outskirts. On the American side, Fox's decision bought what his commanders needed most: time. The delay forced on the Germans by the barrage allowed U.S. infantry and artillery units to withdraw in better order from threatened positions and to assemble for a counterattack. Without that pause and the damage inflicted in Somo-Colonia, German troops might have pushed more deeply into the Serchio Valley, unhinging a fragile defensive line. When American forces, supported by stronger artillery and reinforcements, counterattacked and retook the village, they found the house where Fox had made his stand reduced to rubble. In and around it lay his body, the bodies of several Italian partisans who had stayed with him, and the bodies of more than 100 German soldiers who had been killed by the very barrage he had called down. The stark contrast between the small number of defenders and the mass of enemy dead testified to the scale and precision of the fire he had directed in his final minutes. The German push through Somo-Colonia failed to achieve the breakthrough its commander had sought. The front line in that sector bent but did not break, and American forces eventually stabilized the situation and resumed their slow advance northward in the months that followed. In the larger context of the war, the battle for this one village was small, but for the men on the ground, it marked the line between disaster and survival. After the battle, the silence that fell over Somo-Colonia was the heavy, uneasy quiet of a place that had seen too much in too short a time. The snow that had dusted the roofs earlier in the day now lay streaked with soot and dirt, and the air smelled of burned wood, cordite, and the bitter tang of high explosive residue. American and Italian survivors moved carefully among the craters and collapsed buildings, searching for comrades, gathering wounded, and marking the dead. The house that had served as Fox's observation post no longer resembled a home. Walls had caved in, roof beams lay broken like matchsticks, and shattered furniture jutted from the rubble at odd angles. Beneath and around that ruin lay Fox and the partisans who had fought beside him, their bodies mingled with those of the German soldiers his final fire mission had destroyed. For the men who came back into Somo-Colonia, the scene was sobering. The cost had been high: many Americans and Italian allies killed or wounded in the defense and withdrawal, but it was clear that the German casualties were far higher in the immediate vicinity of the village center. In official tallies, Fox's final barrage was credited with killing roughly 100 of the enemy, a remarkable figure for a single observer's last coordinated strike. In the days that followed, the front shifted again as units rotated, rested, and prepared for further operations in the northern Apennines. The Americans did not abandon the sector, and the Germans, having paid heavily for their push at Somo-Colonia, did not repeat the attack there with the same intensity. Instead, the war in that part of Italy settled back into a grinding routine of patrols, artillery duels, and small advances, while the final collapse of Nazi Germany loomed just a few months ahead. Fox was gone, his body buried in due course, but his comrades carried the memory of what he had done. Citations and recommendations began to move up the chain, documenting the extraordinary courage of an officer who had ordered artillery onto his own position to save others. Yet in the immediate aftermath, the wider world remained unaware of his act, and the war's relentless churn of operations and casualties threatened to swallow his story as just one more entry in a long list of sacrifices. If stories like this matter to you, a quiet like or subscribe helps ensure that the lives behind these distant names are still remembered and not lost in the noise of time. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, many who had fought in Italy returned to the United States eager to move on, and for African-American veterans, that return was complicated by the persistence of segregation and discrimination at home. Fox himself did not come back. He had fallen in Somo-Colonia, but his peers from the 92nd Division and the artillery units that supported it faced a civilian world that often did not recognize their service. Many went back to jobs as laborers, farmers, clerks, and factory workers, folding their wartime experiences into quiet, ordinary lives. In Cincinnati and other cities like it, families of fallen soldiers received telegrams, flags, and, in some cases, posthumous awards. Fox's family knew that he had died heroically, and they knew that he had been recommended for high honors. But the reality of the time meant that recognition for black soldiers often stalled or stopped altogether in the bureaucracy. Official records noted his actions, but the highest award, the Medal of Honor, did not come. Across the country, the stories of many African American servicemen remained within families and local communities rather than entering national memory. Medals were kept in boxes, photographs tucked into drawers, and memories shared, if at all, in small gatherings rather than public ceremonies. Widows, parents, and siblings lived with their grief, sometimes knowing only fragments of what their loved ones had done in far-off villages and forests. The decades after the war saw the United States change profoundly, from the civil rights movement to new waves of historical research into the contributions of minority soldiers. Yet for a long time, Fox's name did not appear in standard histories of the Italian campaign or in lists of the war's most decorated heroes. Colonia itself, damaged in the fighting, slowly rebuilt, its people carrying their own memories of the battle and of the American officer who had chosen to stand and die there. As years turned into decades, Fox's story survived in part because of the persistence of those who had served with him and of villagers who remembered what had happened that December morning. In some accounts, Italian residents of Colonia would later speak of the American lieutenant who had sacrificed himself to halt the German advance, a memory that sat alongside their own losses in the war. These recollections, however, took time to filter back into the official channels of the U.S. Army's awards system. Meanwhile, Fox's family lived through the normal rhythms of post-war life work, aging, the changes of neighborhoods and cities, without the closure that might have come from seeing his actions fully recognized by the nation he had served. His absence remained a quiet fact at family gatherings, a photograph on a wall, a name that few outside their circle knew. The rediscovery of John Fox's story as a matter of national record did not happen overnight. It emerged from a broader effort decades after the war to confront the racial inequities embedded in the U.S. military's awards history. Historians and advocates began to examine the records of African American soldiers whose wartime recommendations for valor had not resulted in the highest honors. Their work revealed patterns of discrimination and neglect that had kept many acts of extraordinary bravery from receiving the recognition they deserved. In the early 1990s, the U.S. Army commissioned a comprehensive study to review cases of black soldiers who might have been denied the Medal of Honor because of prejudice. Researchers dug into archives, reading after action reports, letters, wartime citations, and testimony from surviving comrades. Among the files they examined was the record of First Lieutenant John R. Fox's actions in Colonia on December 26, 1944. The documents told a stark story: a forward observer who voluntarily remained in an overrun village, who directed artillery fire with remarkable precision under intense enemy pressure, and who ultimately ordered the barrage onto his own position to halt the German advance. Statements from witnesses and subsequent investigations confirmed the scale of the enemy casualties attributed to his final fire mission and the importance of the delay his actions created for the broader American defensive line. Initially, efforts to upgrade awards in such cases faced bureaucratic and legal hurdles, including statutes of limitation and the need for congressional action to waive them. Advocates, including military historians, civil rights organizations, and families of the fallen, pushed for legislation that would allow the Army to revisit these old files and, where warranted, recommend the Medal of Honor despite the passage of decades. For Fox's family, this process brought a mix of hope and renewed grief. After so many years, the idea that his sacrifice might finally be acknowledged at the highest level meant reopening wounds and revisiting stories that had long been too painful to dwell on. Yet they, like others in similar situations, persisted, working with officials and researchers to ensure that his case remained on the table. One of the emotionally powerful moments in this long effort came when government officials reviewing Fox's record confronted the full implications of what he had done. The clinical language of military reports could not entirely blunt the fact that a young officer had knowingly given his life in a way that doctrine described as almost unthinkable, calling down a barrage on his own coordinates. For some involved in the review, the realization that such an act had gone without appropriate recognition for half a century underscored the urgency of correcting the historical record. As the review process advanced, Fox's story began to appear more often in articles, lectures, and discussions about African-American heroism in World War II. Veterans who had served in Italy or who had passed through the same units sometimes spoke about him in interviews, adding personal texture to the official documents. These recollections helped anchor his story not just as a case file, but as a lived memory of courage, shared by those who had survived where he had not. The final recognition came on January 13, 1997, more than 52 years after Fox's last transmission from Somocolonia. On that day, in a formal ceremony at the White House, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to the families of 7 African-American World War II soldiers whose heroism had finally been acknowledged at the highest level. Among them was First Lieutenant John Robert Fox. The citation summarized in compressed language the events of that December morning: how Fox had volunteered to remain in an overrun village, how he had directed artillery fire with deadly accuracy, and how, fully aware of the consequences, he had ordered the last barrage onto his own position to delay the enemy and save his comrades. It emphasized that his actions had contributed greatly to slowing the German advance, allowing other units to reorganize and counterattack. For Fox's widow and family members who attended, the ceremony was both an honor and a reminder of all the years that had passed without it. They accepted the medal on his behalf, standing in for the young officer who had never come home from Italy. The setting, the East Room of the White House, the presence of senior military leaders and national media, stood in stark contrast to the quiet, working-class life he had left behind in Ohio when he went to war. Between his death in 1944 and that moment in 1997, more than half a century had elapsed, enough time for generations to be born and grow up, for neighborhoods to change, for Somocolonia to rebuild, and for the veterans of the Italian campaign to grow old. The gap highlighted how close his story had come to being permanently buried in archives and fading memories. Today, Fox is remembered in multiple ways, in official Medal of Honor lists, in articles and documentaries about the Italian front, and in commemorations in Somocolonia itself, where locals honor the American officer who died in their village to stop a German advance. His name stands alongside those of other forward observers and infantrymen who, in moments of extreme danger, chose to risk or give everything so that others could live. The choice he faced on that cold December morning was both unique and representative. Unique because few are ever asked to decide whether to bring destruction down on their own coordinates. Representative because throughout the war, countless ordinary soldiers made decisions to stand to cover a retreat, to hold a line, knowing the likely cost. Fox's story reminds us that the outcome of great campaigns often turns on the actions of individuals whose names we may never hear unless someone goes back, searches the records, and insists that they be remembered. Most of the Second World War was fought not by famous generals, but by men like John Robert Fox Young, often from modest backgrounds, sometimes serving in units that their own country undervalued, who did extraordinary things on single, terrible days, and then, if they survived, went home and said little. In Fox's case, he did not live to grow old, to raise children, or to tell his story in his own words. But the echo of his final decision still reaches us across the years, in the testimony of witnesses and the rubble of the house in Somocolonia. If you've listened this far, you are already part of keeping that memory alive. If you feel like adding to that quiet act, you might leave a like or subscribe so that more people who care about these forgotten stories can find them. And if you wish, share in the comments where you're listening from and whether someone in your family served together. Those small notes form a living record that sits alongside the official citations and ensures that the people behind the dates and coordinates are not lost to time.